Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Jude Kelly, the Artistic Director of the Southbank Centre, and we're kicking off this morning for the start of the WOW Festival weekend. The whole premise of the WOW Festival is to celebrate women, to celebrate the history of women, to celebrate women's stories, to introduce women to each other for the extraordinary things that they are doing, and then to ask the inevitable question about what obstacles are still placed before women in terms of them realising their potential, and what self-suppressing do women do, and what can they do about it. The festival is made up of all different kinds of opportunities for people to meet and talk and discuss. So if you don't know everybody in the room this second, and there will be more and more people joining as the day goes on, can I just encourage you to meet each other, to talk. It's not a networking opportunity in a business sense, although it can be if you wish it to be, but it's definitely a friendship opportunity. As the day goes on, you'll have multiple choices as to where you go with your wristbands. Some rooms are much fuller than others, so the thing I would ask as well is that if somewhere's full, and it was the thing you absolutely desperately wanted to go to, then decide to be happy about the thing that you're going to instead. Because what's the option? We had a Sunday morning session at the last WOW about economics, and everybody said, look, we really want to know a lot more about how the world works economically, and certainly how this country works economically. And that at Davos recently, I think only 17% of the global leaders there and the global movers and shakers were women rather. Certainly wasn't the other way around. So there is always a sense that maybe the conversations are not including everybody's story. And one of the reasons that we asked Stephanie to come to talk to us today was just basically to give us, to a certain extent, a kind of beginner's guide to where we're up to with the economy. Let me just introduce who's on the platform with us at the moment, and I'll explain the format. On my farthest right is Rahul Bakataki, who's a social entrepreneur who co-founded and nurtured 2 high-impact social enterprises. And he's also, since 2010, been associated with the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, who we'll be talking about later in the morning. And then to his left is Savitaben Patel, who's been with SEWA since 1980, when she joins as the team leader. I'll tell you more about SEWA shortly, but it is a cooperative that works with over 1.5 million women from poor and challenged backgrounds. Then to her left is Jamuben Ayar, who for several years ago, during severe and frequent droughts, she had 2 options, either to forcibly migrate or work at earth-digging sites. And she's worked with SEWA on how to create a livelihood in her village through hand-embroidered work, and we'll talk more about that too. We then have Cathy here, who has held many senior executive roles in banking over the last 15 years, and most recently, she was the Chief Administrative Officer for Lloyds Banking Group. Previously, she was a member of the Executive Committee of Barclays plc, where she was Group HR Director. And earlier in your career, I think you were an Investment Relations Director. She's a council member of the Royal College of Art, Vice President of UNICEF UK, and a board member of the Institute of Financial Services. Sadly, we haven't been able to bring Miriam Somerset-Webb. She's stuck in fog in Edinburgh. She sends her good wishes, but there's nothing we can do to get her here, so we'll just have to wish her well while she stands in the airport, seething. But finally, and not lastly, Stephanie Flanders. Stephanie was the person I rang up immediately when we thought about doing this economic session and said, would you please bring us an overview and a sense of sense. As you know, Stephanie is currently BBC Economics Editor and has been since 2008. She was previously a reporter at the New York Times, a speechwriter and senior advisor to the US Treasury Secretary, a Financial Times leader writer and columnist, and an economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the London Business School. She's won many awards, including the 2010 Harold Wincott Award for Online Journalism. So the format is this. Stephanie is going to talk to us for a while. I'll then question her on 1 or 2 things. Then Cathy is going to talk about her own perspective of where the economy is and views she has on it. Then I'm going to turn to discuss SEWA, and then you'll have a chance to fire some questions too. And then we'll have a break, and we'll deliberate. So can I hand over and thank very much Stephanie Flanders.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone here for making it sort of first thing on a very grim Friday morning. You say, Jude, that you want to encourage thinking about economics, but it sounds like you had the economics session on Sunday morning last year, and Friday morning. Maybe you need to have it later in the day when people are getting into the swing. I'm not going to talk, as Jude suggested, I'm not going to really focus on women particularly in my remarks, because I know that I'm going to talk to Jude about it afterwards, and we're going to be focusing a panel more on that. And in fact, it isn't something I do think about all the time. I think women are very important for the economy. I also think men are very important for the economy. I don't tend to think of economics always in gender terms. But, I mean, you can't get away from these things entirely. In fact, having just rushed here from taking my kids to school, I know that there's always things that will affect my life, the way I work and the way I think about economics, that come from gender. And actually, I learnt that one the hard way. I became economics editor, as Jude reminded us, in 2008, in the spring of 2008. I then went on maternity leave about 3 months later, in the summer of 2008. I left the economy, from the BBC standpoint, in the hands of Robert Peston, and all hell broke loose. We had a massive financial crisis in autumn of 2008, and I was literally holding the baby, sitting on the sofa, breastfeeding, while the world financial system was crashing around our ears, thinking, blimey, I do like my daughter very much, but I've just missed the story of a generation, probably several generations. But since then, my friends have actually started to blame me for some of the things that have gone wrong in the last few years, because I was cursing then that I'd missed this great story. And of course, it now feels like just the beginning, the sort of firework display before this really long-running saga of the financial crisis and the troubles in the Eurozone. And when I came back to work after my 6 months maternity leave in January of 2009, the economy was just entering recession. And in a sense, the story had shifted to the real economy and the effect of the financial crisis on ordinary people. I mean, the funny thing was 2008 was actually a very good year for people's living standards and real incomes, because in many ways we were insulated from the crisis. And the result of that insulation was a very large budget deficit, because the government was in effect sort of keeping things going, by not necessarily even by choice, but just because of the structure of the economy. And even the following year, actually, real incomes rose more than they had in the previous years, again because of this support for the economy that was being offered by what we call the automatic stabilizers. But it clearly has been an incredible time to be studying economics, let alone try to explain it on the 10 o'clock news. Very obscure bits of monetary theory that I didn't necessarily pay very much attention to when I was doing A-level economics. I suddenly find myself having to explain on the 10 o'clock news quantitative easing, really things that were just in the footnotes of my economic textbooks, or things that happened in the 1930s in this sort of dark old era, happening now, and in many ways happening to a greater degree than they happened in the 1930s. I mean, one of the big changes when you talk about sort of understanding the economy, I think the way we think about where we live has really changed as a result of this crisis. Again, when I was first studying economics and when I went to Harvard, it was a time when people were very interested in the transition economies. The Berlin Wall had just come down, and all of these countries that had been part of the Soviet system were having market mechanisms put in. And it was, for economists, it was a really exciting time when the people who'd been focusing on developing countries and the people who'd been focusing on developed countries kind of got together, because there were these countries that were in some ways developed and in other ways not very developed at all. And that was a time when we sort of associated financial crises and currency crises and ministers having to resign and marches on the streets over cuts we had seen those, I mean, in the 70s and obviously during the Thatcher era, but the really big financial crisis we associated with developing countries. With, it was sort of Mexico had financial crises, and when I was first at the US Treasury, Thailand had financial crises. Now we've had this major financial crisis on our doorstep, and indeed also in the city for a period. And in fact, it's the emerging market countries, Thailand, all these countries that had already been through the fire in the 90s, are actually seeing their credit ratings in international markets go up, just as ours are going down. So I'd be interested to hear what Cathy thinks about this, because in a way, we've become the sort of risky markets and the safe bet when people are looking for investments. They're sort of thinking, India is a safer bet than Britain, certainly than a safer bet than Portugal or Greece. So that, for me, is a real change. And economics is at the heart of things, for better or worse. I mean, journalists are known for liking bad news because it gets us higher up the running order, gets us on the front page rather than page 7. And I've had a lot of bad news that I've had to break to people over the last few years, and I do quite often wish I had good news to share, but we've certainly been at the centre of things. And I don't think in the past that they were asking the economic journalist when they went to do a report on the economy in Europe, whether you've taken the hazardous environment course, which you have to do at the BBC if you go anywhere where there could be sort of riots. But I've actually been stopped from going to some places because I haven't done a hazardous environment course, and I say, well, hang on, I'm only going to cover this economic programme, but it's a country where they've had lots of riots and where at least the very paternalistic BBC thinks I might get into trouble. Where are we in terms of our economy and a sort of stock take of the things that the government's been worrying about and a lot of economists worry about? Well, borrowing, I know you spend your lives probably hearing about the deficit and George Osborne saying we must bring down our deficit. And clearly we're not where they hoped we'd be at this point. And one of the things that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, though, do keep saying in the last few years, the last year or so, they've been saying, we have our deficit strategies on track because we've cut the deficit by 25%. I have to say, not violating any of my BBC impartiality, this really annoys me as an economist because, well, for two reasons. The main reason it annoys me is because they're talking about the deficit, they're talking about the amount of new borrowing that we do every year. But they know very well that people don't hear that when they hear they've cut the deficit by 25%. What people hear is they've cut the debt by 25%. And occasionally ministers even fall into the trap of saying, we're paying down debt, we're balancing the books, we're writing down debt. Debt has gone up massively. The stock of accumulated debts that we've built up in the past, and we build up every year that we're still borrowing, that we still haven't got enough money to cover our spending, has actually gone up considerably. I'm just looking at this. It's gone up by 27% since they took... I think it's gone up by about 60% since they took office. And that's not because of any decision that they've taken, but the stock of debt, like the mortgage of the country, has continued to go up because each year we're taking on new debt. We're running a new overdraft, which sort of gets added to the debt at the end of the year. And it sort of annoys me. Jude said people want to understand economic concepts. For me, that's quite a sort of... And I'm sure that anyone in government would do the same things. I don't think it's particularly a conservative thing. But that's just taking advantage of the fact that people don't know, and including presenters on the Today programme, don't know the difference between deficit and debt. Now, it is true they have cut the deficit by 25%, but that is not that much, actually. They were hoping to cut it by 60% in these 2 years. They also wanted to, and the Governor of the Bank of England and everybody else wants to rebalance the economy so that you actually not only get past the financial crisis, but make it less likely that it'll happen again. Are we a different kind of economy? That's what they want, is a different kind of economy than the one we had before the financial crisis. Well, we are different. Borrowing's down in terms of personal borrowing. House prices have fallen in most places, though not in the hallowed ground of London. Pretty much everything is down, so in that sense we're different. But that's not really different in the way that economists wanted us to be different. I mean, in fact, what is interesting, I talked about the 1930s, it looks like this 7-year period for the economy is going to be the worst, not just since the 30s, not since the 20s, but actually in a century. It's very hard to find any decent records that you could find a period that has been as bad for the economy as the last few years. We've only grown about 1% since 2010. And that's rather less than the government was hoping. The government was hoping for 6% growth. If we'd had even just, that wouldn't even have been a normal recovery. If we'd had a sort of slow recovery after 2009, we would have grown by about 6% since then. We've actually grown by, as I say, just around 1%. So this is really very different from what we've had in the past. We were really hoping to sort of not have very much demand here because everyone had to pay off their debts and the banking system had to get itself back in order. We were hoping to get demand from the rest of the world. Unfortunately, everybody else had the same plan, and we can't all export to Mars or the moon. So we've just all ended up with less demand than we hoped. We haven't been able to borrow demand from other countries. Employment, is obviously a crucial aspect of this, and I have to say has been something that's been very different from past recessions in a good way, because although we had a much steeper decline in our national income, a much deeper recession this time around, it fell by about 6 or 7% in the course of second half of 2008 and 2009, you would have expected that to produce at least a 6 or 7% fall in employment. I mean, a really devastating rise in unemployment. In fact, although unemployment did go up in the recession, it didn't go up nearly as much as you would have thought. And since the sort of trough of the recession, employment's actually gone up by about 2.5%. We've had a growth, even since 2010, of about 500,000 extra jobs in the economy. There's 1 million new private sector jobs which have been offset by about 500,000 jobs lost in the public sector. Now, there's lots of concern about what those jobs are, who they've gone to. There are certainly big gaps in the experience of people. You might have heard on the radio this morning, actually, one of the really striking things of the last few years is older people staying in work or going back to work in their 60s. We have, I think the number of the share of those over 60s who are now in work has doubled in the last few years. And it's particularly women, actually, who've gone back into the workforce or have stayed in the workforce. People often in quite senior jobs are staying in the workforce rather than retiring. And maybe that tells you something. I think it partly tells you something about lifestyle, that people just want to carry on working longer. Also, I know in many cases also tells you that people are maybe going to work in B&Q because they just can't, their pensions aren't covering their outgoings. But that is a sort of striking change from the past. Of course, the other side of that is that young people are finding it much harder to get work, and they've been much more disproportionately affected by the last few years than maybe would have been true in the past. But it's still very striking, this rise in employment, and of course it's something that the ministers trumpet a lot because it's sort of the one positive thing to say about the economy. But I think it genuinely is positive. Even if we don't think all of these jobs are fantastic jobs, we do know that being out of the labour market completely is really bad for your long-term financial options and for your life, and that's why you would particularly worry about people not getting on the job ladder young, because that can affect them for a very long time. But for other people as well, I mean, if you think about how the pain of recessions, the ones that many people in this room, and certainly I lived through in the 80s and the early 90s, when we had a recession in the early 80s and the 90s, basically there was this kind of loss of output, there was this pain, and the distribution of it was just, okay, this X number of people are going to be unemployed, and everyone else is going to be okay. So these people would just completely lose their livelihood. In the 80s, it was 2 million people working in manufacturing, and a lot of them in the north of the country just lost their jobs, and they were out of work for so long they really never got back into work. That was a devastating cost for them. And they bore the brunt of it, and everybody else, a lot of people actually would have done perfectly well in that period because other parts of the economy were growing. This time around, I mean, George Osborne talks about, we're all in it together, and people can debate about the changes that he's made. But it actually has been a much more equitable recession, if you like. I know that sounds crazy, and we can talk about what's happened to bankers' bonuses in the last few years and everything else. But if you take the vast majority of the population, the pain of this period has actually been, it has been greater in aggregate than the pain of past periods, but it has been much more widely spread. I'm afraid the counterpart of that is that real incomes have really been squeezed. So people have stayed in work, but their real incomes have been squeezed, and the living standards is really what's taken what's taken the hit. And actually, again, when you talk about historically unprecedented, by the end of this period, over the end of the Parliament, we might well be back to the kinds of income or average living standards that we had in real terms a decade ago. And that's, again, not something that's ever happened, certainly in the post-war period. So all of this, very unprecedented. But, as I've hinted, I think there are some sort of positive aspects to this that we shouldn't forget. In terms of the future, what kind of big economic themes are we going to be talking about in the future? Well, I think, slower growth is going to be one of them. People talk about the new normal. We're not going to see maybe the same kind of growth that we saw in the lead up to the crisis, partly because of the effects of the crisis, partly because we're becoming an older economy. We're becoming more service-driven. So, more people are doing jobs in the service sector and retail or consulting or architects or hairdressing, and it's much harder to get productivity growth in those sectors, to be getting more with the same number of people. And actually it's that gets you higher living standards, because you need to be creating more wealth with the same number of people. So it's hard. For all those reasons, you can expect growth to be lower. But you can also expect this really kind of radical change in the global economy, where all these countries that I was talking about at the beginning, these developing countries that had had so many crises and had so much trouble catching up with the rest of the world, have really come into their stride in the last few years. And I know people see it as a threat sometimes, what's happening in China and what's happening in India. But I mean, historically, when people go back to this period, they may well, the financial crisis will probably get a chapter, but I suspect the title of the book or the subtitle will have something to do with the growth of the emerging market economies. Just one brilliant fact on this. If you go back to 2007, the economies of the G7 since 2007 have only grown by about 2%. Or 1.5%. That's in total have only grown by about 1.5% in real terms. In that time, China has grown by 40%. India has grown by a third. I mean, again, we've not seen that kind of convergence before. The speed with which countries like China and India are catching up, and I think it is very exciting. The other thing I think I'd say when you talk about understanding economics, and I do try and do this on the news, but we only talk about the macro. We only talk about these big numbers, the GDP figures, employment figures. Almost no one's individual experience actually matches those numbers. As various surveys of past recessions have found that in the early 80s, for example, more than half of households were actually earning more at the end of the recession than they were at the start. And 1 in 6 had actually seen a more than 50% rise in their incomes. Now, you might not think that we'd see similar figures for this recession, but you'd probably be surprised. You'd probably find that a very large number of people had much higher incomes, and then other people have had much lower incomes. That's the nature of an average. When you look at the very sort of what we call, the micro data, promotions, having a baby, moving, all of these things actually can have a much bigger impact on your living standards, your personal living standards, or people around you, than the kind of stuff I'm talking about on the news, and whether we're in recession or not, whether the euro is going to survive or not. These micro things actually make a real difference. And I said, we're going to be worse off than we were a decade ago, or no better off. Or maybe some of us would like to go back to 10 years ago. I wouldn't mind, going back 10 years. But I'm not really sure. If we actually think about our daily experience, are we actually worse off than we were in 2002? I mean, I know that people who haven't got work, there are lots of people who will feel that they're worse off than they were last year, let alone 10 years ago. But if you think about our kind of daily experience of life, 10 years ago, there was no Facebook, there were no smartphones, there was no Sky Plus. I know these things sound kind of Kindle. I know these things sound kind of really, we're just talking about the sort of luxuries of life. But what's interesting to me is people don't consider them to be luxuries. And the iPhone was introduced in the summer of 2007, just before we had this terrible period. Nearly 1 billion smartphones have been sold in the world since then, in this extraordinary period for the global economy. In the UK alone, millions of iPhones. It is not just the rich who are buying smartphones. And because people are actually getting a lot more out of these things, that is really reflected in their price. The number of Sky subscribers has gone up by another 1 million just in the last 2 years. I think Sky is really expensive. But that isn't just rich people who are buying. They've got 11 million subscribers in the country. Nearly half the households in the country have got Sky. So I just think, not everything is represented in the macro, and not everything is represented by GDP. There are ways in which our experiences have got worse that are not measured in GDP. I accept that. But I guess I do feel that some of the sort of things that have happened with the digital revolution are maybe offsetting, or at least a little bit counteracting, the rise in inequality that we also hear about, that's been absolutely astonishing. So I guess that's my message to you is, you're not going to be average. You may not be interesting in your life, that's up to you. You may be very boring or you may be very exciting, but I don't think you're going to be average. And don't think of yourself as average when I talk on the news about, the average household or the average person. I will have to carry on doing that, but I also remember that it's not necessarily talking about you. There is a famous story about the economist who drowned crossing a river that had an average depth of 1 foot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie, for 2 reasons. I think that I am probably average in this sense, that not having studied economy at all as a student, I now am ricocheting often between my generalized philosophy that I'm excited that the world, or the underdeveloped world, is actually fast moving and becoming the developed and the advanced world. So philosophically, I'm on the side of that. And at the same time, there's an anxiety always that in your own land, you might sort of slow down to a sluggish and then, almost retrograde space, and that your own children, grandchildren, friends and family might actually get stuck economically and not being able to make the most of themselves. I'm going to come to Cathy in a minute to discuss this from a kind of particular female point of view. But if one of the things that we know about government policies throughout the world is that they are very, very concerned now to introduce policies that will liberate girls and women to work. So the workforce issue, regardless of whether you believe in women's rights, regardless of whether you're interested at all in women's potential, just as a GDP issue, advancing women is something which many, many governments are now saying. And I've just got a couple of statistics, which is that if women in the Middle East and North Africa were fully integrated into the workforce, average household earnings in the region would increase by 25%, for example. And they're talking about Japan, saying that if women entered the workforce more fully, that could solve the Japanese economic crisis. So obviously, women being in the workforce throughout the world becomes a big issue. And is that true here in terms of shifting the ability to have growth, or have we hit that ceiling already?
There's some interesting, you're absolutely right, and I didn't mean to suggest that I wasn't interested in women's potential. I'm hugely interested in women's potential. I don't spend my time thinking about women's issues, although I always, think it is crucial. And actually, the more you think about development economics, I'd certainly been focused on women. And Larry Summers, who I work with in the US Treasury, one of the papers that he did at one of his first bits of academic research was actually finding that the single most valuable investment you could make in the developing world was to invest in female education. So that's been a long-running theme. And funnily enough, you talked about Davos. You'll be surprised to hear that the chief executive of Goldman Sachs, who many will think of as a sort of satanic figure. Actually, they're terribly interested in this, and they have a program called, I think it's called the 10,000 women, 100,000 women, 10,000. They're going to increase it because they've already got so many. But it's a program which is about creating female entrepreneurs. And it was in response to their economist, their chief economist, I think Cathy Mitsui, who is in Tokyo. She did a study on just that, saying that Japan could basically almost get past its economic problems if it just got more women in the workforce. Actually, they do have women in the workforce, and the women are very educated, but the tradition has been that they leave the workforce when they get married, and they've just lost all of that talent. One result has been that the children get a fantastic education at home because they have all these educated women at home, but obviously it's not necessarily good for the economy. In terms of the UK, I'm going to say, so I think there's enormous potential in other countries and places like Japan, as well as places more in the developing world. I think I'm right in saying, I think Sweden has probably maxed out on this. They're the example that have really taken the most advantage out of helping women get in the workforce. And it has to be said, one side of that is that you have a lot of women in the workforce, and a chunk of them, a very large chunk of them, are women working, looking after the children of the other women who are in the workforce. So there is in a sense, you're formalising the work at home, paying for it, that now would be done within the home. It becomes a financial exchange, and some people would say they'd like to still be making it possible for the women to be at home looking after the children. But for memory, I think we have a few percentage points left that we could go. We're sort of maybe a little bit above average in Europe on that. But yes, we could definitely tap more potential of women. We certainly, when it comes to sort of the cost of retirement and getting people to work longer, getting people to helping women stay in the workforce longer, as apparently seems to be happening from these figures that came out today, is a sort of win-win for everybody. If you don't think, which I'm not sure that I do think, but unless you think that some of those jobs could be going to young people, but I actually think they're different jobs.
Mm-hmm. There's a big debate about migration at the moment, which I think gets confused myself, because immigration and the use of welfare points is one whole debate. But immigration as part of an extended workforce seems to be the way that countries, again, do push themselves into growth, because most of those migrants are young, and we have an aging population. So is there something there about retaining the idea that the UK stays open to migration as part of its economic style?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. I mean, I think, one of the reasons you're seeing some of the politics around this that you have recently is perhaps the Labour government didn't pay enough attention to just the sheer numbers, and certainly at a local council level there was just the economists and others who just got the numbers completely wrong. I mean, I can't remember exactly. I think they thought that about 40,000 people would come from Poland, and in fact 700,000 people came. I mean, that's quite a big mistake, even by economic standpoint. And we sort of laugh about it and we think, oh, it's a terrible mistake. The implications of that for local councils were dire, because they just didn't get any support for this massive, in some cases, really big increase in their populations. And that's made the experience of immigration much worse for people, because it's, the schools are overcrowded, there's no room in the hospitals, all of those things, no housing, they're getting pushed off the housing ladder. So I think it needs to be sort of managed carefully, but you're quite right that it's a way, when you look at the US, one of the reasons it's had faster growth is it's got higher immigration. It's also got a higher birth rate, which itself is related to immigration, because, as you say, the young immigrants tend to have babies. But the fact that young immigrants have babies is sort of a clue to saying you can't carry on doing that forever, because those immigrants become residents, and then you need to get more, and those in the end, the immigrants get old and they need pensions and they need everything else. So you want to continue to have the dynamism that comes from having immigration, but you don't want a chunk of your domestic, your sort of homegrown population to be systematically undermined. And I think that has been a fear in the last few years, that the people who have not got jobs, even in the Golden Brown era, the pre-crisis era, have often been actually sort of native, white English men particularly outside London, were being locked out. So you have to do both. Also remember, when you talk about living standards, it's income per head. So just you can get more heads and more income, but if it's divided across the more heads, you're not actually raising living standards. And that's one point that the migration people make, that you can talk about how we have all this great growth, but if we've also got a lot more people to support, it doesn't necessarily mean as much. Okay, thank you. Now, obviously none of you are average, so you'll all be thinking different things. But the sweep of complexity that you've presented, both domestically and globally, means that one can understand, although not sympathise, with why the issue about women's employment and women's advancement and women's potential is seen by many as a detail in this big story, as opposed to a 50% of the story issue. So I'd like to turn to Cathy and just say, from your standpoint at the moment, how does the growing understanding of women's potential marry up with the sort of tsunami effect of economic crisis? How are those two things working well together or negatively together?
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Wow, haven't we covered some complex areas already? And one message I would give is the challenge in this complex world is that so much of the flow of information is sound bites, and these are complex structural issues, whether it's immigration or financial crisis or global development. So one of the things I encourage people is to get beneath the sound bites, because just participating in the thought processes of these complex areas actually is fun, as well as being more informative. I a little bit like Stephanie, I don't spend time separating men from women in economic space, but one of my observations in 30 years of work is some women have a nervousness of engaging in the debate around economics, and that might be because they never chose to study economics. I was lucky I chose economics as a degree subject. I didn't realise at the time how foundational that knowledge would be in terms of my business life. I just enjoyed the subject. But once you get, it's a little bit like any discipline, once you get the basic architecture, the terminology, and that foundational knowledge, you can export that knowledge to help interpret many things in life. And I think one of the wonders of economics is the foundational knowledge. And you don't actually need much of it. You need a little bit of the micro, which is all around demand and supply and pricing. And you need a little bit of the macro, including the language. And you can probably use that core information to understand a lot of the dynamics that are going on in the world at large or in an individual country. So one of the things that I would encourage, and I'm delighted to see it in the agenda here, Jude, is opportunity, if you haven't got it already, to go in and maybe venture into territories that you've not been comfortable in before, gather a little bit of that knowledge, and then realise how easy it is for you to use that knowledge in day-to-day life. Because actually women are, even if you don't put the label economics next to it, women are participating in economic decisions in the day-to-day life. Stephanie mentioned at the micro level, whether you're going doing your weekly shop, whether you're deciding to save money, whether you're deciding what's value for money on expenditure or what's value for money in terms of savings. Those are all economic decisions at heart, and women are actually pretty good. Why are they pretty good? Because we're pretty conservative on average, going back to that one. In fact, one of the research has shown is that women tend, when they run their own businesses, we're going to hear a lot more about enterprise, women tend to borrow less to invest in a business. Now, the issue with that is that in the short term, it means there'll be a correlation between the speed at which you get growth. It will be slower if you borrow less. But what data shows, if you look over long term, is that those businesses can tend to be more sustainable. Now, why do I think that's important as we go forward? Is one of the things that we've learned painfully from the crisis is that unfettered capitalism. Now, you never get quite unfettered capitalism with regulation, but we went through a period of the boom where deregulation globally was being put in place in many, many industries, and there was an overconfidence in the ability of a market-based economy to allocate resources appropriately. And that commitment and strong belief that became almost universal led to overconfidence in terms of activity, risk. I've spent a lot of time in banking. Risk was mispriced. What we learned from that crisis, along with many other things, is that unfettered capitalism isn't actually going to create a balanced society that we would all perhaps choose to live in. And therefore, one of the consequences of the recalibration that's going on at the moment is to look at how does capitalism, still got a lot to offer, but how does capitalism evolve such that it better meets the multiple stakeholders and the multiple demands. And one of those challenges into the business world is how do you develop a sustainable business? And one of the things that excites me in terms of the women's contribution is that trying to get the balance between the multiple needs, the often competing needs of multiple stakeholders within an organisation and within the broader political spectrum. Women are good, typically, at being very balanced in terms of meeting those multiple needs. And it's those contributions that make me very confident that not only men, as Stephanie commented, but more women participating in the debates of how we allocate very scarce resources is going to be good for women, but more importantly, is going to be good for the economy. So I'm pretty excited at the inflection point we're in is going to make us stronger. We're going to revisit some of these structural issues in the economy, and I think women's participation is high. Now, what depresses me slightly is that the level of participation is lower than it needs to be. A lot of the publicity tends to be around main board when you look at business, and the figures are still poor. There's only 17% of board directors in the FTSE 100 that are women, and if you go to the broader group of companies, the FTSE 250, that figure drops to around 13%. It is good that there are a lot of men and women pushing to get that statistic up, and it ought to be around 50-50. I mean, it just ought to be, and it's an outrage that it's still so low because it isn't a capability issue. We know women are capable. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. One of the things that I looked at in my business is we want participation not just in the boardroom, but there's the ripple effect. The senior management level still hasn't got enough representation of women. So one of the structural shifts in the economy and women's work profile is not just the absolute numbers, but both the seniority and the types of jobs that women do. And I think the signs are encouraging. I think we'll see generational change. But personally, having worked for 30 years, I'm a little bit impatient now and want those statistics to go up higher, and I think they should be higher. And anything we can do individually and collectively to push those statistics up will be good for women, but more importantly, will be good for the economy.
They've been flat as well.
Yeah.
They haven't changed. There was a period where they were going up. In the last 20 years, those figures have not changed, like the percentage of MPs and others. Can I add a really depressing statistic on what Cathy said at the beginning about people, and you mentioned, Jude, about self-suppression. There's a really awful study that's been done, depressing study, one of many that all point in the same direction. But when you get students, they got a group of students to go in and do a maths test. And in some cases, men and women, and in some cases they asked them just to fill out a form that then they had, as part of the form, they had to tick whether they were male or female. In other cases, they didn't get them to do that. And in the cases where they had reminded everyone that they were male and female, the women did worse than if they weren't reminded that they were female. It made no difference to the men at all. But so try and counteract that and remember that you're really good at maths, even if you're not.
Yeah.
77% of women are in part-time jobs. 77% of the part-time jobs are held by women. So just in terms of shedding jobs in this economic crisis and shedding state jobs, state-run jobs, do you expect a collapse of women's work?
You asked me.
Either, both of you.
I mean, what was interesting was they had the growth during the recession, and I said unemployment didn't go up as much as people expected. That was quite a male-dominated loss of jobs because at that point they weren't squeezing the public sector, and in fact it was unusual compared to past recessions that public sector employment carried on going up in that time. It was one of the things that cushioned people's incomes. And the jobs that were lost, if you think of the industries that were really affected, it was manufacturing, particularly construction, which is very largely men. quite a lot of big losses of jobs in the financial sector, which, as Cathy's saying, doesn't have as many women as it might. And then since then, I've got some figures, but it's sort of boring to go into, that the rise in employment has benefited men, and the loss of jobs in the public sector has probably been more women than men. There's an awful period. I think the last few months, the fall in unemployment, I think there was a fall of 40,000 over 3 months, and the ONS figures seem to suggest that not a single woman got a job in that period. I mean, there was no increase in female employment, it was only male. Now, that's not quite representative of the rest of the time, but it's definitely true that more men have been getting these jobs wherever they are than women in the last year or so. I don't think there's been a collapse, though. No.
Not a collapse, okay. How many people here work part-time? How many people are students? How many people are on a pension now and don't work officially, if you see what I mean? How many people are ladies of leisure? Okay, good. There's a quote here from Charlotte Perkins Stetson: "The women who do the most work get the least money, and the women who have the most money do the least work." That may or may not be something we want to contest, but certainly the economic value of the domestic industry of women is not recognised at all. And so that Scandinavian model you were talking about, which is, can women's domestic employment be something which adds into the economy, is something which I think is worth pondering about. But I'm now going to turn to SEWA to talk about the amazing imaginative shift that this organisation made to the women that that it's worked with, which, as I say, is now 1.5 million. And I think that one of the things that we always use microeconomy mainly to talk about developing worlds, and we could, I think, listen to it from our own point of view and think, can some of these microeconomy models that are on a very large scale in some countries, and in particular in India, could they do something like that for us? What can we learn? And that's the point of inviting the SEWA organisation this year. So I'm going to start by asking Savitaben just to talk to us a little bit about this phenomenal growth of SEWA from its original idea. As I understand it, it was to form a collective of women who were suffering violence or extreme poverty, and to find some way that they could create not just livelihood, but a sense of status and a voice in the community. Now, I know that Gujarati and Hindi are how you are going to speak, and we're going to rely on you for translation.
Good morning to all of you on behalf of SEWA. So, Savitaben will speak in Hindi, and Jamuben, who is an artisan herself, she will speak in Gujarati. So my role today is to just translate and put their thoughts to you. सो सविता बहन, पहले जो बताया है कि सेवा के बारे में, कैसे शुरुआत हुआ, क्यों शुरुआत हुआ और आज कहाँ है, इसके बारे में थोड़ा सा.
Namaste everybody. My name is Savita Patel. I am a self-employed women's association from SEWA, founder Sri Ayar Bhatt, 1972 स्टार्ट. और हमारे इंडिया में असंगठित जो वर्ग है ये बहुत सारी संख्या में है, और असंगठित क्षेत्र का महिलाओं को संगठन करने के लिए सेवा इलाबेन भट्ट ने एक कैंपेन उठाई, और हमारी साथ गुजरात में और भारत का अदर स्टेट में 17 लाख जो महिला है वो 4 कैटेगरी की महिला हमारी साथ जुड़ी है.
So, because we were talking of the unorganized sector, in India, 90% of the workers actually work in the informal sector of the economy, and out of the 90%, 80% actually are women workers, and they are always not, they don't have a voice, they are not recognized at all. So, SEWA was set up by a lady called Ayar Bhatt to give a voice to these unrepresented women in the economy. And it started with one state, that is in Gujarat, and started with textile mill workers in Ahmedabad city, where actually SEWA is headquartered now. And then it had spread across 10 states in India, representing 1.75 million women across 10 states of India.
हमारी जो 4 कैटेगरी है, में फर्स्ट कैटेगरी होम बेस्ड वर्कर, घर में बैठ के काम करने वाली महिला, और सेकंड कैटेगरी है वेंडर्स की, वेजिटेबल वेंडर्स एंड फ्रूट वेंडर्स एंड अदर वेंडर्स, एंड तीसरी कैटेगरी है वो श्रम सेवा करने वाली जो लेबर है, एग्रीकल्चर लेबर एंड अदर लेबर, एंड 4th कैटेगरी है वो प्रोड्यूसर, स्मॉल एग्रीकल्चर एंड एनिमल हस्बेंड्री करने वाली जो महिला है वो हमारी मेंबर है.
So 4 categories of informal workers SEWA targets. One is home-based workers. So basically all that 80% of the total informal workforce, 80% of the women actually work out of their home. So home-based workers. The second is vendors. So in India, a lot of the economic activity like selling vegetables and fruits and even fish is done by women. So women vendors. The third category is actually agricultural laborers, because in India almost 70% of the agricultural labor force is actually women and they work in the fields. And the last category of worker are actually people who produce on their own, either from their home or either in a factory or in a small scale enterprise, but they are not represented in the formal economy.
अब 4 कैटेगरी की जो महिला है वो कहीं लोग व्यापारी के पास काम लाती है और उसको न्याय नहीं मिलता है, उसको पूरी रोजगारी नहीं मिलती है, और हमारा मिनिमम वेज है वो नहीं मिलता था. इसके लिए हमने होम बेस्ड वर्कर के लिए पूरी एक कैंपेन उठाई थी और हम मालिक के साथ बैठकर वो कैंपेन को लंबा समय तक चलाई थी. और वो कैंपेन चलाते चलाते हमने ध्यान में रखा था कि हमारी जो बहनें हैं उसको भी काम छूट नहीं जावे और उसको काम भी चलते रहे, और हम उसके लिए कैंपेन के द्वारा हम उसके मिनिमम रोजगारी देने का लड़त है वो हमारी मालिक के साथ चलती रही.
So it all started with a campaign for the home-based workers, and the campaign was directed at the contractors, because all the contractors or the middlemen actually are the linkage between the home-based workers and actually the market. And the whole objective was that, like, the minimum wages were not paid to the women by the home-based workers, because the women didn't even knew what exactly is the market rate or what is the value of the work. And the initial work that SEWA tried doing is actually create a campaign around that particular minimum wage, but making sure that, like, the contractors don't leave behind the home-based workers thinking that, like, now we should not try to work with this group of people, because now there are a lot of noise about minimum wages.
जो हमारी साथ जमुबेन आयर है वो एक होम बेस्ड वर्कर है, वो आर्टिजन है, खुद आर्टिजन है और वो खुद एम्ब्रॉयडरी करती है, और उसका जो एक गुजरात का पाटन डिस्ट्रिक्ट है इसमें वो स्पीयरहेड टीम मेंबर है. उन्हें बहुत सारा संगठन में पूरा डिस्ट्रिक्ट में होम बेस्ड वर्करों को 20,000 जितनी महिलाओं को उसकी आगेवानी के नीचे जुड़ी है. और वो भी थोड़ा बताएंगी कि हम कैसे जुड़े और हमारा पहले की स्थिति क्या थी, अभी की स्थिति क्या है, वो उसको भी थोड़ा तक मैं देती हूँ कि वो भी बोलेंगी.
So she had requested that, like, to share. Jamuben Ayar is an artisan who does embroidery. She is from a district called Patel in Gujarat, and she will share her experiences of where were they about 15 years back and where they are now. Today she is a spearhead leader of 20,000 similar artisans under whom she had trained. And she's also a shareholder of this company that has been set up by SEWA for the artisan called SEWA Trade Facilitation Center, whose revenues today is around $1 million. So Jamuben will share her experiences. Jamuben.
Can I just stop 1 second?
Yeah.
So the extraordinary idea of this, as I've understood it when I was traveling in India, was that it has become a cellular structure, taking all areas of women's work, traditional women's work, and turning it into something where the women are educated to understand the economic potential of the work, how to negotiate for what a proper wage ought to look like for this work that's never been clearly valued, and now it has a sort of market value, and then to train the women to understand that they can train lots of other women, so much so that Jamuben, you are now in charge of 20,000 other workers, training them and making them feel part of this collective. So, I mean, just to describe that in itself is a breathtaking scale of, I mean, whether you call that microeconomy or not, microfinance, I mean, it's pretty major. So I just, I bearing in mind how complicated it is as well to get collective involvement and everybody feeling an ownership, that's something that I'd like us to reflect on. So we were going to talk about your particular experience, Jamuben, and one of the things that I was sort of thinking about in your CV was that you had this opportunity, well, you had this choice either to migrate or work in earth-digging sites, which, as I understand, is literally breaking rocks and taking the rocks to, I mean, it's hard labour. And those were the only choices to make until you took up with the idea of embroidery. So would you talk to us about what's happened in your mind about your and other women's economic potential since you joined SEWA?
जामुबेन, आपके बारे में जो शुरुआत जैसे हुआ था, रीमाबेन जैसे गया था, वहाँ से शुरुआत करके बताइए।
तो मारू नाम जमुबेन, नमस्ते। तमे एक मारी भाषा तो नहीं समझो, पर आजू बाजू बैठा ही समझावशे। तो अमारे आदे अमारे अत्यारे काम करी थी, ये हमारी परंपरानी कारीगरी तो हती ज, पर कोई कारीगरीनो विकास नहोतो। विकास नहोतो एटले अमे एक अभण हता ने घरने अंदर ज रहता हता, बहार नता निकळता, एने कारणे कोई एनी मार्केट ज नहोती। तो बनावी अने अमारा बे घर माटे बनावी, कोई लग्न प्रसंग होय, कोई दीकरी दीकराना दीकरीमां ने देद माटे के साणु के साँदी नथी दई शकता, तो एना माटे बनावता हता। पण જ્યારે રેમાબેન આવ્યા છે ગામડેમાં અને અમારી મુશ્કેલી જોઈ અને એમને પૂછ્યું હતું કે બેનું કે તમે આવું કામ કરો, હું જઉં તો તમે કરો છો કે હા કરીએ, પણ કેવી રીતે? અમે એને પૂછ્યું કે તમે અમને પૈસા દેશો કે વગર પૈસે? તમે સમજતા નહોતા કે મફત તો કોઈ કામ ના કરાવે, તો કે હું પૈસા દઈશ। તો બેને હાથ કુર્તીથી કામ શરૂ કર્યું હતું। तो जरा हाथ कुर्ते नो मैंने ऑर्डर तमे समझाओ छे, बस भूली नहीं जाओ ना।
हाँ, रुकिए, मैं समझा देता हूँ। So she is very passionate anyway, Jamuben. So Jamuben has conveyed her namaskar, and that is the welcome to all of you. And she's saying that, of course, whatever I speak, you will never understood, but Rahul is there to convey my thoughts to you. So she's talking that, like, they are a group of traditional artisans who had inherited the skill from her mother, and her mother had inherited from the grandmother. They have been doing this for the last 100 years or so. But the problem was that, the place where they were, it's very interior, and they didn't knew the value of their work that they were doing. So they were either doing it whenever they want to use it for their own personal use, or if some contractor comes and give them an order, or if there is a marriage that is taking place in their house, and generally, a very heavily embroidered piece of garments actually given to the daughter when she leaves the house. So they were doing it, and for them, they thought that is what the value of this work had. Then there is this lady called Rimaben, who is now the director at SEWA. So Rimaben went to this village long time back, and she was actually doing some survey for drinking water in the village, and then she came across this group of women who can do this wonderful work of embroidery. And then Rimaben asked them that if I give you an order, will you be able to give me some pieces of embroidery? Then the first reaction from Jamuben and 2-3 other women is that nothing is for free. You pay us, I will give it to you. Because at that point of time, what she's saying is that she didn't even know who was SEWA, why they have come, because she was thinking that SEWA is also like another contractor who has come to take something from there at a very cheap rate. Jamuben.
તો રેમાબેનને એવું લાગ્યું કે હું આજે કામ કરાવું મારી બેની કણે, તો મારી બેનીની મુશ્કેલી દૂર થાય, મારી બેનીને 2 ટાઈમ સાંજ સવાર પણ જમવાનું મળે. એને કારણે બેને સર્વે કરી, ગામ ફરી અને બધી બેનને પણ કામ આપ્યું. તો અમારે દર બેન કુર્તા, હાથ કુર્તે શરૂઆત કરી તો અમારે એક કુર્તાના 150 રૂપિયા આવ્યા હતા. અને અમારા ઘરના જે પતિ કમાવા જતા હતા ને તો એને કાયમ 2.5 રૂપિયા રોજગારી મળતી હતી ને અમે એક બેન 10 રૂપિયા કમાતી થઈ હતી. તો બહુ પછી વિચાર આવ્યો બધેને અમેને કે આ તો આપણે બહુ સારી રોજગારી ઊભી કરી. તો અમે પછી એક સંગઠન કર્યું. સંગઠનમાં એમ નહીં કે આ બેન ગરીબ છે તો ગરીબમાં ગરીબ બેન હોય એને પહેલી સાંકળવાની, કે એને એના બેટીને એને 2 ટાઈમ જમવાનું મળી રહે. કોઈ અમે બીજા વિચાર, અમારે ખાધા પૂરતું જ અમે કર્યું હતું. અમે એવું નહોતું કર્યું કે અમે પાર્ટી બની જઈશું. તો તે કરીમાં બેન કાયમ અમારે ભરત દઈ જાય અને લઈ જાય. ત્યારે અમે જ્યારે 500ની 100ની નોટ છે એ અમે ત્યારે દેખી હતી, ત્યારે અમારું ચૂકવણું આવ્યું ત્યારે અમે એમ છે કે આ ડોકરાવાળી નોટ કેટલાની છે? તો કે 100ની. તો અમારી સમાજને નવાઈ લાગી હતી કે એક અમારી બેન 100ની નોટ કમાતી થઈ. તો સમાજમાં પણ પરિવર્તન આવ્યો. કચ્છ કાઠિયાવાડ જાતો હતો ત્યારે આ સંસ્થામાં અમે જોડાના રોજગારી અમે ઊભી થઈ. તે પછી કચ્છ કાઠિયાવાડ જાતા બંધ છે. અત્યારે કચ્છ કાઠિયાવાડ નથી જાતા. પાણી પણ અમને પૂરતું મળી રહ્યું, જમવાનું પણ પૂરતું મળી રહ્યું. તે પછી અમારા પોતામાં પરિવર્તન આવ્યું, અમારા કુટુંબમાં પરિવર્તન આવ્યું, અમારી સમાજમાં પરિવર્તન આવ્યું. અને એક અમેને બહુ અમારી સમાજમાં પાટણ જિલ્લામાં પણ બહુ નવાઈ લાગી કે અમે છોકરીને નહોતા ભણાવતા એટલે અમારા કને પૈસા નહોતા, તો અમે પેન ચોપડી લઈ શકતા નહોતા. તો જ્યારે અમારી રોજગારી આવી એમાંથી અમે પેન લીધી, ચોપડી લીધી, છોકરીને આ સ્કૂલ નિહાળમાં મેળવા પણ જવા શીખ્યો. અને ઘરે બેસી અને રોજગારી મેળવી. અને મોટો આભાર સેવાનો. તો એ જ્યારે સેવા આવી ત્યારે અમે એમાં બધું પરિવર્તન બદલ્યું અને અમારું જીવન પણ બરાબર છે. મગજ પણ અમારું પછી ચાલ્યું છે.
I don't know what you're saying, but we're joining you. We're fantastic, absolutely fantastic. What?
Yeah. So I think I'm not able to bring that passion into my.
Yeah, I can see why you've got 20,000 people working
Yeah.
for you. Yeah.
So I think so it's all started with Rimaben, and she came and she started giving them small orders. Then Rimaben said that, okay, if you do a good job, I will pay 250 rupees for this particular work. Till that point of time, that particular district where they are from, that is a drought-prone area. So around 6 months, there's actually the whole village migrate to other towns like Kathiawar district, because there's no work out there, and it's the whole soil is completely, it's like stone, like, you can't cultivate anything. So at that point of time, on a particular day, the man might, if he's lucky, will be earning around 50 rupees, and 50 rupees will be like, maybe 30 pence, and the women will be earning hardly some 10 rupees. And that is also like, if you are able to get a work, because the whole village migrate, not only that village, the whole district actually migrates. So there's also a lot of competition for this kind of work. So when Rimaben said that they will give you 250 rupees, they were shocked, because they have never seen what she's saying, 100 rupee note in their life. Yeah. And then it all started with that. So the first order, and Rimaben was very clear that I am giving it to you, not this 250 rupees is not a charity that I am doing. You have to give me good quality work. You give me good quality work, I will again get the more orders for you. So it started like that. So then I think the first time they were so excited that all the women who got that 100 rupee note in their hand, they all showed it to each other and saying that I have a 100 rupee note in my hand. And she's saying that that is the power that she got. And then they started valuing their work, because till then the work that they were doing for them, like, it was another, they were just doing it because they feel that, like, they have the skill and they need to keep on doing it sometimes so that the skill doesn't die. I think then it started, then the surrounding villages got very excited, the women out there, because the whole word of mouth, it started spreading about this 100 rupee note. And then they started all getting together. Then they, from the villages, they led actually and started looking for more women in the surrounding villages. And like that, they got together, these women, and they said, let us now get organized, because without being organized, we will still be in the mercy of the middleman, because we will not have a voice, we will not have volumes. So they started organizing, then they started providing training to these women that you need to also start improving your skills. And the whole process, over a period of time it went, and the migration completely stopped from that whole particular district. Today there is no migration in the particular villages from SEWA work. But as SEWA started working, because SEWA, this is only one part of the work that it did, it also started looking at other issues. Drinking water was an issue that it started looking at. It looking at agriculture as an issue. So the women who actually got together initially just for the embroidery started also getting into a lot of other issues like health issues, education issues. And then with the money that they started earning, then they were able to send their kids to school, because before that, because they migrate, they also have to carry the kids with them, so the kids never go to school. So they were able to send the kids to school. They were able to have 2 meals in a day. That is the first time in their life they were able to have 2 meals in a day.
Can I just,
sure.
Ask one more question, which is that this idea, as I know that your daughter is now training to be a teacher, but the idea of a women's collective becoming the vehicle for women's education across all areas, this is something which we don't have in this country. I mean, the trade union movement might have been that, is that at some stage, but my understanding is that for all the women part-time workers in this country, we don't use it in any sort of formal, interactive, educative way. Am I right about that? Cathy?
Yes and no, I would say with it. I mean, I think just listening to the wonderful opportunities being created is how fortunate we are in a country such as the UK, where access to education is a given. Of course, more can be done, etc. But it does, when you hear such heartening stories, make you realise how privileged we are actually.
I think we've got used to looking to the state for these things, but I think you do see pockets, and sometimes it has come at times of hardship. I mean, I remember, when I was in my teens, actually, my sister used to drag me up during the miners' strike. She was working with women in the miners' strike, and actually I remember the feeling of, there were women's collectives that had got together around the miners' strike in those communities where there was a whole year, more than a year, where the men didn't have work. And actually out of that, women were starting to get into other things to help the community. It started off as soup kitchens, and then they were doing things that maybe were about education. And maybe you see that now, the community groups that maybe start for one reason, to get a playground created or something, do end up going into other areas because they discover people can't write, and so they start doing literacy, or they can't. So it's not quite the same thing, but I think when you get that kind of communal action, even here, it's probably it's less common here, or it comes less naturally because people are used to just kind of calling up the council. But I think you do sometimes get that.
I think this issue of collective action is a really key one, and that's not counter to the idea of a compassionate state. However, I think that this idea of self-determination is a very important thing that perhaps the whole weekend we'll also discuss. Can I just ask you one more question, which is, do you now feel as a community leader that the areas that you've gone on to around violence against women, around education, around economic independence, do you see that as having had a big influence across other aspects of Indian culture? I mean, would you say that SEWA is affecting the way other people do their work and think about their work?
એટલે આજે અમે સેવામાં કામ કર્યું તો એથી એક તો અમારા બેનને મોટા કયા ફાયદા છે કે જે કાચ ને કાંઠે હતા તો એ બંધ થઈ ગયું, એ બેને કડે ફાયદા આવ્યા. પછી બીજા ફાયદા એ છે કે અમારે કોઈ અમારામાં મારું નામ નહોતું પોતાનું, કે પાણી તો ભાઈનું, છોકરો તોય ભાઈનો, દીકરી તોય ભાઈની, ગાય તોય ભાઈની, કોઈ પણ નામ નહીં. તો એક અમારા નામ કામ સાથે રોજગાર સાથે અમારા નામ બહાર આવ્યા કે હવે એમ કે કે થોડી તો જમુબેનની, લડકો તો જમુબેનનો, અને પતિ તો મારું નામ લઈને કે એના ઘરના. તો એક નાનું વાહન હોય તો કે જમુબેનનું, એ અમારું એક નામ બહાર આવ્યું. સેવા સાથે જોડાણા ને રોજગારી પણ મળી. પછી બેનનું કોઈ પણ ચાય નામ નહોતું. અત્યારે અમારે બેન સમાન બધી જાગૃતિ દળે બેન કરે, ભાઈ કરે ઓછી ને બેન કરે વધારે, એવું આ સંગઠન સૌથી. પણ પછી એક અમે ભરતકામ નહીં, ઘણા અમારા આમાં બેનું કામ કરતી. કોઈ ગુંદરનું કરે, બબૂલ કહેતા હશે તમારામાં, અમે તો ગુંદર કહીએ. નમક એટલે મીઠું, અમે મીઠું કહીએ. એનું પણ કામ કરે છે. તો એ બેનને કેટલા ફાયદા છે. તો હવે અમે એવો વિચાર છે કે અમે ઘરને ખૂણે હતો, ઘરથી બહાર આવ્યા, બજારમાં જ, અને પૈસેવાળા પાર્ટી હોય ની તો કંપની બને. પણ એક આનંદ અમે બહુ છો સેવાથી કે અમારી એક ગરીબ બેનની કંપની બની, એક અમારું નામ બહાર આવ્યું. તો હું અહીંયા બેઠી છું.
I think the biggest impact of the work that the SEWA has done, and also the work that they did as a spearhead leader, is actually what she actually represented a very interesting story, because previously her son, her daughter, her work were never been told that this is Jamuben's daughter, this is Jamuben's son, this is Jamuben's house, this is Jamuben's cow, this is Jamuben's agriculture. But once they started actually getting a voice, when they started getting organized, I think people then they actually started doing that. Oh, this is Jamuben's kid. Oh, this is Jamuben's daughter. And even she said that, like, people started also addressing their husband as, oh, this is Jamuben's husband, because till the way. Then and the work that they started with the embroidery group is that they have started spread this work, the whole ability to bring women together into a collective and giving them a voice. They have now spread it to even other groups of women who work with in the salt fields or the salt pans in agriculture. And even like, they started with a village, then they went out of the village. They were in a situation where, like, they were not allowed to even go out of their house, forget about the village. So I think when they they get organized, they started getting managerial skills, marketing skills. They knew how to start keeping their own records, and they took their products to the market themselves. She had not mentioned that, but like, I think she's very humble, but 2 years back, every year we go to a folk art market in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And for some strange reason, like, two artisans from SEWA, they went together in one flight, and she was left behind because she got the visa late. And she took a flight on her own from Ahmedabad to New Mexico. I think she had to change flight in 2 places in Washington and Dallas. She still was able to reach there without knowing English or without knowing Hindi. So I think that is the confidence or the changes that the whole, I think this work with SEWA that has brought.
One of the reasons I thought it was important to try to pull this ground together is that very often when one's discussing economy, you start from the top. It's all about women on boards, women CEOs, etc., etc. And not that that isn't an important subject, of course, but the reality is that most women live in poverty. In terms of the relationship between their labour and how much they work and how much they get paid. And actually, in this country, fortunate as we are, there is still a whole strata of women who are completely separated from their ability to confidently and assertively make their own life economically independent. And that's not just to do with childbirth and domestic responsibilities and so on. Anyway, we won't go into all that now, but I think that over the weekend some of these things will get unpacked further. There's more sessions this weekend talking about work-life, talking about childcare, talking about all kinds of issues. But can I just end this session by thanking Stephanie and thanking Cathy and thanking Jamuben, thanking Savitaben, and thank you, Rahul, for really a very invigorating first session. Thanks a lot.